Well, welcome everybody to the roundtable part of the Trottier Public Science Symposium. This is one of our most interesting events because it's sort of free-flowing and everyone chimes in. And before we introduce everyone, I'd like to ask Professor Chris Manfredi, who's the Provost of the University, to officially open the symposium.
Thank you very much, Joe, and thank you all for being here. I want to thank you, Joe, for your organization, and also congratulate everyone in the Office for Science and Society on organizing another great Trottier Symposium. And of course, I want to acknowledge Warren Trottier's presence here and for his support of this symposium, as well as the support of many other things that we do in this area. The Trottier Symposium always begins with a roundtable, and this is the second year in which the roundtable has been open to the public. And I think that's a very good thing. The discussion is interesting. It's my great regret that this year I can't stay for the entire discussion, but I know it will be interesting because it was last year, and I think it's very informative to the public. So so I'm very glad that over the last 2 years the decision has been made to open to the public. I want to particularly thank the speakers of the symposium who are here with us today: Erica Johnson from the CBC, Joel Achenbach from the Washington Post, Julia Belluz from Vox.com, and Trevor Buttercombe from Sense About Science USA. I know you'll enjoy hearing from them over the next couple of days, and I want to again wish you the best and express my regrets at not being able to be here, but also express my thanks and welcome on behalf of McGill University. So with that, you can start your proceedings, Joe. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, we're just going to do a very quick introduction because I don't want to take too much time away from the more interesting discussions that we can have. Trevor Butterworth, one of our speakers, comes to us from the US, although originally from Ireland. And he's the director of Sense About Science, which is an organization that makes sense of science, right? What else can we say? Julia Belluz writes for Vox, which has become a huge online enterprise and is outstripping newspapers. Right? Joel Achenbach, on the other hand, writes for a newspaper, the Washington Post. And he's also written a cover story for National Geographic on the war against science, which of course is very appropriate for our discussion here. Erica Johnson is known to almost all Canadians because she hosted Marketplace, which is a wonderful TV show for 15 years, and knows all about the ins and outs of investigative journalism. So we will, of course, hear from them. And we have a number of people to get involved in discussion and ask questions. Dr. Adam Brown is one of our office associates. He's from the University of Ottawa, and he is a biologist by background, but delves into all kinds of other areas and is a specialist in communicating science. Andre Picard is probably Canada's premier health journalist, and he writes for the Globe and Mail. He writes on a large variety of topics, always fascinating to read Andre's columns. Julie Payette, until today, was the director of the Montreal Science Centre, but of course is well known as being one of Canada's astronauts and was up in space twice and looked down upon the Earth and can testify that it's round. Lauren Trottier, of course, is the benefactor of the symposium and is a ferocious advocate for science, evidence-based science. Bill Brownstein is reporter for the Montreal Gazette. Pascal Lapointe, welcome Pascal for the first time. Pascal writes for La Presse, which is Montreal's French language daily, no longer newspaper, but online publication. And Chris Labos is a cardiologist, but that's just part-time. What he really likes is communicating science to the public. So with that in mind, we have some interesting questions here that we think are worthy of discussion. And we may not get around to all of them, I don't know. But the way that we will do this is we'll start with one question, and we'll first get you guys' notion on it, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I think that the first one is an appropriate one to start with, and that would be, what is the biggest challenge in all of your attempts to communicate information and particularly science to the public? So Trevor, maybe we'll start with you.
Okay. I think obviously there are many authors to bad science and many authors to the poor understanding of science. But I think one of the critical things that has been documented empirically, at least in the United States, is the failure of scientific education to actually convey what the scientific method is to a great proportion of the public. We see in the 1950s, just after Sputnik, there was a deep concern in the US that Americans were not prepared for the space race against the Soviet Union. And public opinion surveys showed that maybe 10% of Americans understood what the scientific method was and what it involved. Good news, the more recent attempts to measure this quality now has roughly 29% of the American public understand science as a method. And the problem with many people not understanding science as a method is when it comes to issues of uncertainty. People like certainty. They want to know solid and stable facts. And science is a house that is constantly being rebuilt in terms of its facticity. So what do the public do in the absence of grasping science as a method? Well, they interpret it through values and narratives. And these values and narratives are shaped by community and political allegiances. So it becomes incredibly difficult to challenge what the scientific community, or the majority of the scientific community, would regard as scientific nonsense if you have to battle against strongly held beliefs and values. And I think that's our biggest challenge.
Julia.
I couldn't agree more, especially about the issues of communicating uncertainty in a space where a lot of people feel very anxious and want certainty. But one piece that I find very challenging to navigate are the vested interests, in particular in the medicine and health space. I've become more and more sensitized to looking at papers and noticing that, in particular in areas like food and nutrition, that the funding comes from, this walnut study is going to suggest that people can drive more, drive fast. These studies actually exist, by the way. Blueberries are some incredible elixir for life, funded by the Blueberry Council, the Walnut Council. And
that's not true.
The whole blueberry as antioxidants thing was a kind of, the blueberry industry wasn't doing very well, and
Wow.
but yeah, no.
I had no idea.
Right. So anyway, navigating these vested interests, I find really difficult, and especially in places where a claim is really taking off, and you look and find that this doctor who's promoting this amazing ultrasound or whatever it is, he actually owns stakes in the ultrasound company. And it's kind of this funhouse mirror situation where, it's something tricky to navigate, and also I think important to communicate to audiences.
Joel.
I may have sort of misread this question because I focused entirely on myself in that question and not the public. The public's great in general. They love science. They're really good consumers of science journalism. Yeah, they can get things wrong, and and as Trevor said, they often don't understand what the scientific process is, and that science is not just a pile of facts, that it's a process for trying to get closer to the truth. But in general, the public's great. But I work for a newspaper. Our industry collapsed, essentially, and I've been at the Post for 26 years, and it's just changed so much. So the biggest challenge for me is, what do I do today? How do I do journalism? Do I write a long story to run in the Sunday newspaper? Do I do a quick little blog item? Do I go on Twitter and just try to be part of the Twitter conversation? And I mean, the center of gravity has moved a lot from, old school publications like the Washington Post towards, really excellent publications like Vox. But we all have the same issue of like, what story do we chase today? And one of the challenges is that at any given day, there's a story that's trending. That story is often malarkey. Can I say that word? Is that, I mean, it's not, it's like, it's a story that's like kind of bogus, or it's old, or, it's like an asteroid will pass close to the Earth. Well, there's always an asteroid passing close to the Earth, and it's probably not really something we need to worry about, but it's trending on Google. Do we jump on that? How many times can you write actually, we're going to be okay, asteroid's not going to hit a story? I mean, there's, so do I do that today? So for me, the biggest challenge is just figuring out, what the heck am I going to do today as a science journalist?
Erica, because I think you come from a different angle because you've always had to think about visuals as well to go along with the stories.
Yes, and often making science visually interesting is a challenge. I can certainly relate to you. I think every journalist in the room, Joel, would say that one of the struggles is not just immediacy, what do we jump on, but how much is this going to cost? Right? There are fewer and fewer organizations actually funding investigative or longer form journalism now, so to be able to operate in that milieu is a real privilege. For me, I think one of the challenges is persuading editors and so on that responsible journalism has to give equal voice to both sides of a debate. Sometimes there is no balance required. Sometimes there's only one side to a story, and that sounds odd to say as a journalist, but that's the truth. And the blowback that we get as a journalist, if I've done stories that particular community isn't happy about, and then we end up being buried in complaints to the CBC ombudsman, which take time. And so every time you do a story, you think, what are people going to say about this, and how much time are we going to be able to dedicate and resort to that, and do we actually want to do that? So to not back away from stories that are controversial, and then to figure out where the truth lies and cover that, criticisms be damned.
Okay, does anybody want to ask a question or make a comment about this particular topic?
I sort of agree with what everyone said. The biggest problem that I've always had whenever I try to write a piece, either for the Gazette or for Maclean's or wherever I happen to be writing at that time, is that I put a lot of work into that piece. I'll spend 4 or 5 days researching it, talking to people, writing it, getting it just right, and it goes out there, and I'm very proud of it. And yet in that intervening time, there's been about 50 blog posts on Natural News or some other place that have just been spouting ludicrously untrue facts. And I kind of feel sometimes that I'm trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. It's that you're just not getting anywhere. The internet has been very good in that it's democratized information. It's given people access to information that they never would have had before. But it's also given access to a lot of people who are very unprofessional in their journalistic attempts. So I sometimes worry that people are just I think people are interested in science, but they're facing this deluge of false information out there. And sometimes I worry that whatever little contribution we make maybe just isn't getting there because it's being drowned out by all the white noise.
Pascal?
Well, I agree certainly with everything that has been said, and I can add something more. The biggest challenge I face in my attempt to communicate information to the public is to have the resources necessary to reach that public. At Agence Science Presse, when I'm working, we are a small not-profit media. We're the equivalent of 3 to 4 full-time people. We almost disappeared 2 years ago, just as the only science magazine in Quebec just almost disappeared. And in a sense, every science journalist in the world is suffering for a lack of resources. We all know that science is never a priority in mainstream media. But in a small market as Quebec is, it's even worse. And why am I saying this to you? It's because this is a thing that almost all scientists and almost all people criticizing science, the way science is covered in the media, are frequently forgetting. It is that if you wish to have better science in the media, you will need to have more science journalists. New media or old media, it's as simple and as complicated as that. we will have to find a way to help media to hire more science journalists.
Thank you. Bill?
It's funny because the radio station where both of us are on frequently this morning said something to the effect that one Brazil nut a day will build up my selenium supply and then enable me to battle any kind of disease. This is a nutritionist, and the problem with stuff like that, as you well know, is that stuff goes unchallenged. So people, curiously, I called up the producer of the show and said, how many people have called to find out where they can find Brazil nuts, and if they have one Brazil nut, they wanted to know if they had 10 Brazil nuts, if that would... The problem is that this is under the guise of someone who's a professional nutritionist, so people believe, but I don't know that there's any scientific data one way or another to support that. There might be. Then she said that salmon was also very good, but you got to be careful with salmon. But selenium and Brazil nuts, well, that was the answer. And it's that pie in the sky kind of stuff that the public loves to hear. I'm sure they'd love to know that science supports that, but do we know anything?
Well, I think we know something. I think that's part of the problem is that, and this is the point that was raised before. I mean, there was this person very clearly, or maybe not that clearly, had a conflict of interest, right? They were going on the radio to promote themselves, and I don't know where they work, but almost certainly they were doing that to raise their profile, to get more customers to come in and sell their services. And so we talk about conflict of interest, and the obvious one is the pharmaceutical industry and how they've become involved in medicine and funding studies, which is a big issue and something that has to be addressed. But there's a lot of different types of conflicts that we just don't talk about, and it's the conflict of self-promotion. Nobody's ever going to come out and say, you know what, my study was not that good. If you spent 5 years working on something, you're not going to come out and criticize yourself. That's just not human nature. And so that's why we need journalism. That's why we need sort of a certain degree of academic rigor in everything we do, because people are not good at self-critique. We have to have an external critiquing process. And so a lot of radio and TV is driven by people who are willing to donate their time because it's marketing for them. And there's very few academics who are willing to donate their time because they just don't have that much free time, and many feel that it's not worth their while, which is a shame, because when producers in radio and TV are trying to find experts, sometimes they're forced to take whoever they can, and many of these people are not truly impartial and academic.
Well, Julie, the purpose of a science center was to promote science, right? That's the challenge.
It is, and the fortunate thing about science centers is that we're catering to the basics, and for those people who do visit, they will get a big chunk of basics, but being encouraged to use their mind, their critical thinking, their sense of analysis, to ask questions and not to take everything for granted, because I believe one of the greatest challenges we have now is the sheer multiplicity of sources, the sheer amount of experts that we have, the vested interest one, the political ones, the ones that want to push an issue, and the ones that are purely just interested into entertainment. A good example of that, last year, I don't know for the panelists, but the question we were trying to solve here at the Trottier Symposium was, is there anybody in the universe? And then this year, we're trying to figure out if there's common sense in the universe. And I'm a little bit better at the former than the latter. But about a year ago, I don't know if you remember, but there was this big hype about selecting astronauts to go on a one-way mission to Mars by 2024. So you were going to become a member of a colony and will never come back on Earth. And there were people flocking from all over the world putting in their application to this Mars One, it was called. So at one point in time, there was one media outlet that asked if I could comment on this, and I went on there, and they gave me 5 minutes, and they gave this wannabe person 30 minutes. They didn't want to hear what I had to say. I was going to tell them that we weren't going anywhere in 2024, let alone on a one-way mission to Mars. That was not fun, and that was not entertaining, so they didn't want to hear about this. After that, my phone didn't ring much anymore. But these guys were still on the radio and on TV being interviewed, and they wanted to know what they would say to their mother when they're going to go into the rocket ship and go to Mars and never come back. That's like asking me what I would say if I'm elected president of the United States. I will never be elected president of the United States, so, well, I can always say whatever I want. And this is where it is, we're at an age where it is just going so fast, there is so much, that we need to find ways and to teach ways to discriminate. And one of the ways that I try to teach my 13-year-old at home is when he goes on Google. And anything that shows up on Google must be true, especially the first sponsored link. So I say to him, no, you have to go sources that are serious. Yeah, that you wouldn't be so worried about quoting at home. And then I need 3 times those serious sources saying the same thing, and maybe there we're starting to have evidence-based facts.
Ron, you want to say something? You didn't sign up for the Mars trip.
But you would, if it was credible.
I'm a big Mars fan, but I do think that sending people on a one-way trip would be marketing hype, somebody trying to make a fast buck from gullible people. But I was struck by one of the things that Trevor said there about, it was Trevor, that the public is open to hearing good science journalism, or maybe that was Joel. But I think one of the things with the public is that we see from various public opinion polls, including the ones for Donald Trump, that people are prepared to believe all kinds of things that are false. And the large segments of the public, probably a majority of the public, lacks the ability to do critical thinking and really try to separate, have the tools to separate fact from fiction. I think that's a big problem. One of the things that also came up here, which I wanted to comment on, is the business of conflict of interest, that often science, people who come on television and pitch a particular point of view, and even some scientists would be tainted by who's sponsoring their research or where they're making money and so on and so forth. But that kind of accusation also gets falsely used to discredit people who have a legitimate point of view. So a lot of activists will criticize somebody, he's a shill for whatever the food industry or for the cell phone industry. People think that cell phones cause cancer and so on and so forth. And for the public to try to make sense of all of this confusion is really difficult. So there's a need for people to develop these critical thinking skills.
Adam.
Yeah, well, there have been a lot of angles already to be taking this topic, and I could take a personal angle as a science communicator who enjoys going on TV and radio and talking science. And personally, I feel one of the greatest challenges are dealing with misconceptions that are out there for all of these reasons that we've been talking about. And maybe even more generally speaking, because of the massive amount of information on the internet, a lot of which is nonsense, of course, and people tend to adopt certain conclusions that fit well with their life's narrative or with their own bias, and so it can be almost like a personal issue when you take trying to clarify some misconceptions, and people tend to double down, and I'm much more of a lover than a fighter, so I don't really enjoy that antagonistic fight that you get into. It really quickly becomes a flame war, and so, well, in terms of talking about personal challenges, that's the one that I find the hardest, and my response is more to inspire and share my awe of nature and so on, as opposed to pontificate and attempt to clarify from the academic's perspective, which I could also do, being that academic who likes to pontificate. But it's not really as effective when the goal is to share science and to provide information that people can use effectively. But the other thing I thought maybe was interesting to add on to what you guys were saying over here in the state of journalism is being sort of sad with respect to resources and dwindling abilities, and I totally get that for sure. And one of the things that I like to see as a component of that as we move forward is engaging scientists in that discussion, and not just science journalists, which I certainly think have a role, but the traditional role of the scientist has not been as a communicator to the public. We well know that's the case if you were just Google scientist stereotype and see what pictures come up. We're seen as being these poor communicators and closeted weirdos, and there's a good reason for that, because well, there's a lot of truth to stereotypes, but it's also because we haven't had that training as part of our careers becoming scientists. And so that's one of the angles that I like to take as a biology professor, is to infuse the learning experience of future scientists with skill development and in being able to engage with the media and to communicate with the public. And hopefully that means we can sort of all move forward together and not be purely the responsibility of journalists to provide science or scientists to do science, that we can also work together on that front as well.
Well, last but not least, I think what I'm hearing is the biggest challenge we have in communicating science to the public is that there just isn't one public anymore. There are multiple publics and multiple sources. So and all this in a backdrop where there's scientific illiteracy. So what we have is people in the digital world, it's really easy to have an opinion and then find facts, and I use that word in quotes, to back it up. So people have all kinds of wacky ideas and they find confirmation. There's a lot of confirmation bias going on. So I think the challenge for us, or for me as a journalist, is how do you present evidence and try and convince people that, this is actually true and what you believe is not true. And, we live in a world where opinion has the same weight as evidence. And the louder you shout, the more important your opinion is. It's Trumpism. We see it all through the media, not just in politics. So there's all these challenges. And again, as we've heard, all this with the traditional media breaking down. So anybody can get on a blog and say whatever. And sometimes the more outrageous, the more inflammatory you are, the more popular you're going to be. And therefore, your opinion's more valid. So it's all this mixture of challenges that I don't envy my children's generation. How do they make sense of all this? And I think the great failing we have of our education system is, as Julie said, not giving them the tools to figure this stuff out. We can't teach them everything. There's too much stuff, but we should be able to teach them how to wade through all the crap and actually find truth and evidence.
Unfortunately, it's possible to graduate both in Canada and the US from high school without ever having had a course in chemistry or biology or physics.
Or without being able to read, for that matter.
Right. So, but we expect them to be literate, to be able to read, but not scientifically literate, which is just as important. Trevor?
I have a couple of things to respond to some of the things that were said, and actually I want to present a positive view of certain developments. One historical trend in science journalism has very much been to ignore bad science, in the sense of if a journalist at a leading publication would look at a new study that has an elaborate claim and decide actually, after interviewing a few people, that this is not true or it's largely nonsense, they wouldn't write about it. But somebody would. So the information would get out regardless. Now we are seeing, even in my sort of 17 years of having been a journalist, now I'm on the science advocacy side, a change in attitude towards what journalism should be and how it should deal with complex problems. And you see the rise of a generation that is more data aware, and it manifests in publications like Vox, but also 538, the new Stat News production at the Boston Globe, the blogs at the New York Times and Washington Post, the Upshot and Wonk blog. And this represents a new kind of analytic journalism that is willing not to follow this is the latest news, I must report the latest news, or not report it if I don't think it's interesting, but actually to think more deeply about what the news means. I think that's great, and we need more of it. I also think the internet has created great opportunities for scientists to communicate. And there are many wonderful projects in which scientists are creating publics. And I think that needs to be embraced. So there is really positive aspects to this when it all seems gloomy. And they need to be remembered. And I would use one anecdote to describe how there is a significant difference between the media landscape we have now and the media landscape of even the early 1990s or the 1980s. If many of you may remember the ALAR scare, which was about pesticides on apples. When CBS 60 Minutes went out with its story on ALAR, you had panic. You had extraordinary stories of parents trying to chase down school buses to have the apples taken out of their children's lunchboxes. But there was no means to challenge. There was no mediated means of challenging those claims, which eventually appeared to be wildly overstated. The same kind of thing can't really happen, I think, in today's media environment because of the multiplicity of voices. And because you can go online and go on Twitter and see that there are groups like the Office of Science and Society which are challenging people to think more deeply about these narratives. And this may not be a perfect solution, but it's a break on the idea that the internet has simply created a tide of nonsense.
Well, that's actually a good segue into the next topic, and Adam alluded to that too, the possibility of conflict with people. And it's sort of not in our makeup as scientists to get into battles with critics, but I think we are being forced into that because many of the anti-science advocacy groups are very good at what they do and attack us very, very vigorously. So the question is how to handle this. So that's why I'd like to ask you guys if you've ever had any such attacks about anything that you've written or done, and how you've handled it. Maybe we'll start with Erica this time.
Sure. Where to begin? I think certainly on Marketplace, we've tackled quite a few controversial topics that have a very organized community that have not been happy with our stories. So I'm thinking particularly of our homeopathy investigations and our stories about vaccines. So we've had people organize picketing outside the CBC Broadcast Center when they didn't like our first investigation into homeopathy. We were given a secret email that was circulated amongst the homeopathic community saying this story is about to air at 7:59 p.m., bombard their website to try to shut it down so that nobody will be able to read the material or watch the item online. And then Twitter is well, it's a requirement really for a lot of journalists these days because you want to promote your stories, you want to interact, it's a place you can find sources, but what we do on Marketplace is the hosts, we're always, a banner will come up on the screen that says, tweet Erica now, she's live on Twitter. So during these stories, you'd get some folks that would say, good on you, CBC, but then other people, I've been called the devil, I've been called, in the back pocket of big pharma, all kind, and it's hard to react to that. I just keep, please see above, and I'd tweet something, and well, actually, we're referring to this verified study versus whatever you're quoting, and they would start sending links, and I think you just have to have a thick skin. If you've done your research and you know what the facts are, there will be people who disagree with you. It's not great to be called chastised, or whatever, condemned really on social media, but it happens.
Ever had anything more serious than just picketing?
No, not. Well, one person has said you should be silenced, but that's not a.
Obviously, that didn't work.
Yeah. No, but I think it's there is a culture out there that people think that you are creating harm if you're speaking out against their beliefs, and that is a hard thing to battle with. And I have to say, I mentioned before that CBC handles all criticism. We're the public broadcaster, nationally funded, and so if people file a complaint with the CBC Ombudsman, that goes up the chain. It takes lots and lots of time and revenue, and that's not something that we're happy to have to deal with, but you can't shirk your responsibilities either.
Joel.
Well, I did that story that ran a year and a half ago in National Geographic. It was the cover story. The headline was "The War on Science," and it had a great cover, I thought, of an astronaut on the moon in a museum, and there's a guy on a stepladder fixing the helmet of the astronaut on the moon. It's sort of a joke photograph of to play off people who think the moon landings were faked. But the article, we talked about so many different issues, from vaccines to climate change GMOs, to evolution, and we made everyone mad. So I got a lot of angry email about that. But it's interesting. Most people who emailed me directly, they actually didn't scream at me or say that I was the devil or I was in the pocket of someone. They really wanted to engage on these issues. And I said before that the public is great, and obviously that was an overstatement, but it is a fact that people respect science as a kind of ultimate arbiter of whether something is true or not. I mean, science has won in a way as a kind of institution. If you want to win an argument, you have to have some kind of appeal to what the evidence says. Now the problem is people have their own evidence. They have their own they have their own way of getting the data that confirms what they already believed. The confirmation bias, and they live in these echo chambers, and in the echo chamber, it might say that, well, this climate change thing is a big hoax, and I'll never forget 20 years ago, and I covered the Heaven's Gate mass suicide near San Diego, when I think it was 39 people ate applesauce laced with cyanide so that they could be transported to a flying saucer that was following Comet Hale-Bopp. And you think, well, that's the craziest thing you've ever heard. They all amassed a library of literature before they did this tragic thing. They had books, they had magazines, they went to lectures, they bought a telescope and went out to try to see the spaceship. Now, what does that tell you? Well, obviously, it was a cult. It was led by a guy named Marshall Applewhite, who was a cult leader. But people seek evidence for what they believe, and the problem is that that there's so many charlatans out there. There are people who present stuff that's bogus. But the people's natural instinct is to find out what's really true. So in any case, with this War on Science piece, a lot of people wrote to me. They just wanted to engage a little bit and find out why did they believe something that National Geographic was saying was bogus. And most of those email discussions were I think, useful to those readers. So that's in general the way I handle these controversies is to turn off my computer and go walk in the woods because it's hide. But anyway.
Yeah, there's many of these kinds of attacks and emails, and I think it really hit home to me how you don't become immune to them. You always try to be fair, and it never feels good to be the subject of one of these. But this summer I wrote a piece about traveling in Italy and how some experiences with the food there and the childhood obesity crisis there. And I quoted my German boyfriend, who I then got an email from a reader saying, I can't believe this German boyfriend, he's offended my family, and who could this terrible person be? And I forwarded it to my boyfriend thinking this is like a little bit, I thought it was kind of like funny, quite frankly. And he was devastated, like thinking he's not used to being the subject of these attacks. So you get used to it, but it's been from everything from the vaping community, when I've written about e-cigarettes and some of the uncertainty about the harms there, absolutely inundated on Twitter to the extent that I think there must be some organization there from these companies to kind of fight back against people. Writing about Dr. Oz, his people reached out to my CEO to ask to kind of like, of my media company to ask to drag me into a meeting. And I said, sure, if it's on the record, I'm happy to meet him. And they backed off. I've been, accused of being Monsanto Discredit Bureau operative planted at Vox for writing critical things about natural health products. Scientists who have claims about diet have asked to investigate my work at Vox. So I think there's no end to it, and the only thing you can try to be is fair and that you're accurately representing science and real discussions that are happening. And I don't know what the alternative is. Like, what the alternative is to be scared and not write these things. I don't think that's the alternative. So Yeah, just having a thick skin.
Yes, if you, as Dr. Joe will know, if you dare to question the idea that any dose of a chemical is highly toxic and responsible for whatever condition you feel is it might be ailing you, you invite a great deal of criticism. And it is not just from the environmental activist groups, which are extraordinarily well-funded and who have a vested interest in promoting these kinds of scares, but also the scientists and the journalists who either are doing this line of study, perhaps fully in the belief that they are working toward the truth. Similarly with journalists, and if they start winning prizes based on toxic scares. It is, the detail of these stories are extraordinary. They really shattered my faith in journalism back about 7 or 8 years ago, that journalists could cherry pick data and cherry pick sources so egregiously to back their narratives. But on the other hand, if you're a critic and you're going to put people up against the wall and hammer them with critique, then you've got to expect them to fight back. They're not going to say, oh yeah, sure, I see where I went completely wrong with that particular point. However, the approach now, I think, conditioned by a lot of experience of this, is that we have to presume that everyone has a conflict of interest, that we are all predisposed towards our own belief systems, and that what we see in science, happening in science, is that there is something of an epistemic crisis with various fields in science, based upon study design and statistical rigor. Psychology is in deep trouble. And we see scientists cleaving to claims which the significant parts of the scientific community have, I think, comprehensively demonstrated are false, are not true, and are hurtful to thousands of people. So the antidote obviously is not an antidote, you keep going, but I do think better questions need to be asked of everybody who's making a scientific claim, and that those questions are, was your study designed so that it actually answers the question it asks? Did you collect good data? And did you do the data analysis right? Those are tricky questions. They require a lot of resources to ask and to answer. But until those questions are answered, we're not going to know good science from bad science. And to attribute motive, as in somebody has a vested interest, is simply a cognitive shortcut that fundamentally is unscientific.
Well, we certainly have been attacked for all kinds of things, and whenever say anything about the cell phone risk not being real, etc., we always get is, yes, but Lorne is in the electronics industry, and therefore we have to protect the electronics industry. I mean, this is so absurd that it's beyond words. And I mean, Lorne, you've had personal attacks.
I've had that. I've had people accusing me of, I do own a company that makes high-tech products that are used in computers, but none of our products really emit Wi-Fi radiation or whatever. We're not making cell phones or wireless devices or things like that, but I still get accused of that. There was a piece that ended up that we tracked down that was written by some blogger in Australia that circulated amongst the whole activist community that somehow I had a conflict of interest, that I owned shares in a major telecommunications company. I don't know where they got that from, but it was all bogus. It was all made up. But when you try to counterattack, so one of the leading activists in Canada, by the name of Magda Havas, had done a study which ended up on one of the national TV programs here in Canada. Some sort of, I forget the name of it. It was on global TV. Where she had this guy that had a heart rate monitor connected to him, and he was exposed to a cordless phone, and his heart rate suddenly went all wild in front of the camera, and so on. And so we challenged her to bring this guy to Montreal. We recruited the head of cardiology at the Jewish General Hospital to examine this guy and to do a proper, see if we could replicate the results. no way, you guys are, crazy. If he comes to Montreal, he goes to the Jewish General, you're going to kill him. All that equipment, you're going to die. Whatever. In the meantime, she has conflict of interest herself because her bogus studies and all her alarmist stuff are used by people who peddle all kinds of shielding devices, pendants, crazy things you can put beds, sheets around your kid's bed to shield them from electromagnetic radiation. People who sell that kind of garbage use her name and her stuff to help sell their products. So.
Anybody else want to talk about that one?
I like Trevor's point. You're right, nobody's objective. But try writing about vaccination vis-a-vis autism. And no matter how much science you present on one side, you will run into a group, as you have run into, who are so well mobilized, who are so well funded, and who are so Hollywood that nothing you can say on the subject you can't bring, even if you try your hardest to be objective, nothing will please. It's like trying to deal with Scientologists on the same level. They're so firm in opinions, and they attack, they're louder than anybody who understands on another level. So, that's what you're up against. And as was pointed out, we live in this world of Trumpism right now, and he who speaks the loudest yells the loudest. That's who people listen to, and that's a scary argument, and people are getting away with it.
I think one of the most organized groups I ever, because the question is, have you ever been attacked? Yes, daily. One of the most organized groups I ever faced was the Lyme lobby, and I wasn't expecting this. Maybe I was naive, but I've written about vaccines. I've written about a whole bunch of other things, and you always get the hate mail. I've been called everything. I've been called things I probably can't say in front of a camera. But the Lyme lobby was the only time when they were really coordinated. That was the only time I ever got something close to a death threat. There were people sort of hoping that me and my family would die a painful death. They didn't actually say that they would make that happen, but that was sort of the closest I ever got. But they actually tried to get me fired from the Gazette, but the joke was on them because the Gazette doesn't pay me anything. So, and they were surprisingly motivated. They were surprisingly organized, and it was about saying that, and they couldn't actually attack the article because the article was science-based. It's look, here's what the research says, here are the studies. And I actually had a very specific topic. I said, look, there's no evidence that long-term antibiotics worked. And look, here are 4 negative randomized trials that have been done over the past 10 years. How much more evidence do we need? So they couldn't attack that. They went at it, and it was the same thing that we've always talked about, which is if you can't fight somebody on the facts, well, then just yell at them and threaten them. And I reached out to a colleague from BC who was a public health doctor there, and he said, this is what happens. Their goal is to make it so uncomfortable for you that you won't actually try to challenge them in the public so that they can own the media space. But the way I deal with it, as terrible as these things are, and I do feel very badly when this happens. Sometimes people forget that you're a human being. It really hurts me when you see these truly, truly hateful things said about you. But the thing that makes me keep going is sort of what Joel alluded to, is sometimes you get very nice emails from people who read the articles and I read your article, I was really interested, and they genuinely want to have a conversation with you because they really want to understand the subject better. And that's sort of the only reason why I keep doing it, because there are people out there who genuinely want to understand and who are very interested to learn more about a subject because they don't know where to get accurate information anymore because they're just hearing so many different things from so many different people.
That's the thing, Joe, there's always been zealotry, but now it's just easier. There's an easier megaphone. There's this thing called the internet. People are very reactive and reactionary. So on things like Twitter, they just let their anger go out. We used to get it in a letter a week later, when I started writing before the internet. So there's always been the complaints, and as Julia said, you develop a really thick skin, but there is a good side to it. The interaction is good. I have no problem interacting with anyone who wants to talk to me by name. My name's out there, you want to do it by name, fine. It's the anonymous comments that I think are really the poisonous ones and the ones that we in the media have to learn to deal with. We have to shut down the trolls who hide in their basements and hide behind these fake names, etc. That's where the real damage, that's where the damage is really being done. And I think that's where, that's where I draw the line. But otherwise, that's fine. We're fair game. We're out there and putting out a point of view, at least I am as a columnist, so I'm willing to have it challenged. But again, I think it makes us a little more careful in our writing, and that's good. The internet, I think, has made me a better journalist, made a more careful journalist, one who researches more, thinks a little more. So there is, as Joel said, there's a good side to this stuff as well.
Okay, the next point was kind of triggered, I must say, by a late night viewing session, because I used to like Larry King. I thought, he had some neat interviews, and then he retired, or was forced to retire from CNN, it's not clear. And I thought that, he had gone back to kind of just retirement with his 8th wife. And then I'm watching this late night TV, and there he is, looking very much like he looked on the set of CNN. And he had the suspenders, and everything looked the same. It's like, gee, he's gone on to another job, started a new talk show. And then pretty soon you find out that what it is an infomercial for a fish oil supplement. I mean, not the worst thing. It's not like he was hawking homeopathy, but still there he was, and it was made to look like a documentary or a legitimate TV show. And of course, pretty soon you realize what's going on when you see that the commercial within the commercial is for the stuff that they're talking about in the show. But this is one example, but there's so many like this. Like in our newspapers, I mean, in the Gazette, as Bill will testify, we see ads that are absolutely outrageous. I mean, total quackery. You see it in magazines. And of course, we all write on the web, and you see some of the ads that appear mysteriously with our stuff for ridiculous things. So, what do you say about?
Print publication ad revenue is declining, so I'm afraid that's the price to pay to keep newspapers around. But no, seriously. I think we need, as Julie mentioned about the first line that came up on Google, there was research carried out by the University of London for the British Library, which looked at the data literacy, the kind of information literacy skills of children using the internet. And it turns out that if you've been trained in the old card index system, or your parents are old school, you have better literacy skills than if you simply absorb the internet. So we do not have good literacy skills, I think, in schools for dealing with these kinds of information. And the biggest manifestation of this is the supplement industry, which I don't know what the regulation is here in Canada, but in the US, you have bipartisan support for virtually no regulation. And I know the FDA is chomping at the bit because they see things like drinkable aloe vera of a certain kind, which are really quite toxic. All sorts of other unregulated products. And absolutely no basis scientific basis for the claims being made about them. But because of the popularity with the public and because of the jobs that they create, it's a hands-off approach from regulation. So this is a big problem with different components. But the failure of our politicians to actually treat this as willful poisoning, perhaps. I don't know what more to say. It's very depressing.
And there's so much evidence of harm. We did a search of, there's all these different databases that you can access, in particular for athletes that record, and at the FDA, that record problems that have been found in supplements. And we brought them all together on a database that we created at Vox. And you could see, absolutely, after that, I already knew and had very strong opinions similar to yours about supplements, but seeing the harmful things that have been found in these, that have sickened and killed people, it's a huge problem. But it kind of reflects, at least from the U.S. side, I think it's the U.S. and New Zealand that are the only countries that allow direct-to-consumer drug ads. And it would be nice if there was some, first of all, more oversight with how that happens. And then maybe if that was extended to some of the natural health products that aren't harmless. That would be, yeah, kind of a dream. But yeah, we need the leadership to take that on. And
well, it's crazy that you have, people complaining about the FDA, sort of allowing bisphenol A, and yet the supplement industry is wildly unregulated, and even in terms of adulteration, we don't even know barely know what's in it. So it's a cognitive dissonance of the highest order.
Example of that occurring right now with FDA recalling homeopathic teething remedies for children because they have apparently killed 10 children. The question is, how can this happen? How can a homeopathic remedy kill kids when, by definition of homeopathy, it contains nothing? Well, it turns out that the homeopaths are not only bad at science, they're also bad at dilution. And they use belladonna for these teething things and don't dilute it properly, so that they actually ended up with a significant amount of belladonna in these because of the lack of regulation. And if you listen to CNN on radio, 25 times a day, this homeopathic company will have their ads for these things. Yeah.
Let me just make a comment about, from the standpoint of a news organization. I work for the Washington Post, and I don't know what our standards are at our paper for an advertisement, but I will say that if someone is going to make a decision on whether a product is safe or not, it's not going to be someone working inside my newspaper, because they don't know. I mean, in the newsroom, you don't have a whole lot of people in the newsroom, never mind in the advertising department, who have a background in science or chemistry, and probably many of them know nothing about homeopathy, and so someone else has to be able to put a seal of approval on it or say this is bogus. Because working in the ad department at a newspaper or a magazine or a TV station, you're just not in that position. You don't have the background to make that call.
And I want to echo that. I mean, I just think it's impractical and unrealistic to think that there could be, someone in your sales department or at the CBC deciding whether a product is valid or not and deserves to be, promoting itself. At the CBC, we've seen ads for natural health products. In fact, a great example of this is a story we did on cold effects, which is a very popular cold and flu treatment in Canada. And we did an investigation into it and found that none of the clinical trials supported the claims it was making, that it actually reduced the frequency, severity, and duration of colds. And yet, our weather was sponsored by Cold Effects on CBC. They ran ads, and when they knew our story was running, they bought airtime during our program. And they bought the little ad online that you have to watch before you could see our investigation into Cold Effects. So they were, and very clever marketing on their behalf, right? To say, well, Marketplace might be saying that we're garbage, but obviously the CBC is giving it a thumbs up because they've given us all this airtime. That was the impression that people were writing us and saying, I don't get it. On the one hand, I'm watching your program and now these ads are playing, and it was really undermining what we were trying to reveal. But you would need to say the likes of Cold Effects or, in the newspapers, there's this back clinic that I keep seeing advertised that claims it's going to stretch your spine and cure everything under the sun. Each of those products and ads, they would all need investigations to debunk them before you could say, well, no, you can't run in our magazines, online, on our TV shows. I do think, though, that better media education is necessary. That little 10-second, what you're watching is an infomercial at the beginning of a half-hour show is not necessarily enough. But literacy. You can't always believe what you see, and I think we're going to be stuck with these ads because they are paying bills, and it's a very difficult industry right now, and we're not going to be turning away people that are going to be giving the ad departments money.
Newspapers are so financially strapped today. We'll take any ad. I mean, a fan wrote a letter to PK Subban, took out a full-page ad, $20,000. I mean, anything will pass. And Don Cherry endorses Cold FX, so, and that speaks louder than any promotional campaign that, like Marketplace or anybody else or any advertiser could put on. But again, I mean, they're going to accept anything these days. I mean, it's a dire situation.
I'm not even going to try to explain to our American visitors who Don Cherry is because it's
Oh,
inexplicable.
yeah,
It's inexplicable. Pascal?
And even if they didn't accept anything, I mean, it's not realistic. If, let's imagine that the media is closing its doors to the supplement ads, another media will take over. And in this internet era, you will have a lot of media specialized in so-called natural treatment that will be more than happy to take their publicity. So that's why the solution is much more on the government side, on regulation, than on the news media side. There is an organism in Canada called the Conseil canadien des normes de la publicité. I don't know what is the English name. It takes complaint from the public. It can only make blame, but one solution, if you want to go in that direction, could be to create a lobby asking that this organism has more power to make pressure and maybe to forbid some kind of publicity. But without regulations, the only solution is on the regulation side.
So I think the regulations exist, and I completely agree with what you're saying. It has to be a governmental push. The regulations do exist, because as Julia pointed out, direct-to-consumer advertising, DTCA, is actually illegal in Canada. So all the ads that you see on TV, ask your doctor about Crestor, or talk to your doctor about this or that, you actually cannot have those on television. And they get around it for a couple of reasons. They put a few qualifiers in there that say, talk to your doctor, we suggest this. They try to make it too definitive. But also, Health Canada has shown almost no interest in prosecuting these people. And the US, which, to be fair, has a problem that it has no regulation, the Department of Justice actually will go after people. So they've gone after Green Coffee Bean. They've gone after a few pharmaceutical companies for Paxil. Yeah. Yeah, so the Department of Justice, I mean, the US, for all its problems and its regulation, does actually bring people to court. Health Canada has never brought anybody to court. Their policy and their procedure, or at least over the past 10 years, when I looked at this a few months ago, was if you're in non-compliance with the law, they will send you a very polite letter asking you to change your advertising. And if you say no, they'll send you another letter. And if you say no again, they'll send you another letter. And eventually people just change just because they get tired of receiving all the letters from Health Canada. But and the same thing happened with health apps. I wrote a story about this a while back. It's like anybody can create a health app and call it a health app, even if it's wildly inaccurate and dangerous to the public. And the problem isn't that that we need more regulation. The laws are there. It's just that we need people to actually enforce it. And that comes from above, and it comes even from above Health Canada. It needs to come from the government, from the cabinet, from the minister, to give Health Canada a more focused mandate to actually go after these things, because there's a lot of inaccurate advertising out there, and if Health Canada had the resources and the will, they could actually probably do a lot of good. But I agree, I mean, asking the newspapers to filter this stuff out is not going to be helpful.
Andre.
I think Erica's point is really important. Advertising is advertising. It's selective truth-telling, if not lying. But so what's important is that it be identified as such. So when you have this advertorial on TV, it's posing as a talk show. So it has to be more clear that it's an ad. What troubles me the most in newspapers, in my newspaper, is not the advertising. It's this move towards sponsored content, we call it. So it looks like an article, it smells like an article, but it's actually written by a company, a PR company, and it, you know, at least in my paper we have clear rules about how it's identified, less so in other media, and less so over time. So there's this blurring of the lines, which is to me the most disturbing aspect. Advertising, to me, that's another part of the newspaper. They do what they do. We have to live with it. That's what pays the bills. But it's when it starts to infiltrate into the editorial content that we should be really concerned, and that's where we lose our credibility.
You know, in the US, for the natural products, they have to put the disclaimer that this has not been looked at by FDA, and it's not meant to diagnose, cure, or treat any kind of disease. And of course, I've talked about that often. And one of the interesting comebacks I get from the natural product industry, you know, when I say, well, how come that you're selling this, why this is? and comeback is that this is really a good thing that the FDA has not evaluated it, because if they would, it would be banned because they're in the pockets of industry and therefore they would not allow us to do this. So it's actually a positive thing that FDA has not looked into this.
I'd like to add an element to this where, because the conversation or the flavor of this aspect has mostly been oriented towards, the effects of maybe advertising and journalism. But if we broaden the scope and look at information at large, and particularly where most of it is found on the internet nowadays, that this age of information is really a massively double-edged sword. I mean, the access to anything you want out there is sort of a defining aspect of our time, but the problem being that most of that is completely unregulated, to use the same kind of language we've been talking about. And maybe even to riff off of something you were saying, that with respect to being able to dissect fact from fiction in television programming, we need some kind of media education. I'd like to add to that it's not far stretched from the nature of the symposium. We need science education as well, and the two of those together would allow, I think, at least some element of critical thinking when it comes to looking at what you're receiving, irrespective of the platform. I just wanted to refer to a quote. I wrote it down so that I wouldn't, totally butcher it. It was Isaac Asimov, whose one of his quotes was, "The saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom." And these quotes are great for a number of reasons, but it's clearly a pre-internet quote. And if you add to that now that we're gathering information faster than we can sort it into facts, and that's limiting knowledge, which is already lagging far behind wisdom, you can see that we're really in a pickle with this. And is there a way out? I don't know, but I think that some kind of scrutiny from the observer's perspective needs to be part of it. And so science education, media education, just critical thinking skills have to be at the base of receiving this stuff.
And we come back all the time with tools. We have to have tools to discriminate, tools to make sense out of nonsense, tools. And one of the things that was an exhibit which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore at the Montreal Science Center. It was called IDTV. And in there we were asking the kids to come and to debate some controversial question, like do cell phone provoke cancer or not? Is climate change something important? And they'd have to go and film themselves on a 30-minute with little backgrounds that we would provide. They could change that. They could basically make their news report on this and send themselves a news report at home. So using modern technology to do something, and then afterwards give a bit of information about the pros and cons of both sides. And this is something where again, we have to be so vigilant. It would be almost, in a perfect world, having something like une appellation contrôlée, a control brand, where you'd have some seal somewhere that tells you, okay, that I can trust, it's a real Chianti, right? It's the kind of thing we don't have. And the tools are not only for the public to discern between what and using their critical thinking, it's also in the school of journalism, in the school of communicators, in the school of those that send out that information. I'll give an example of a radio station here. It's a CBC French, very serious, very good, no vested interest, public money funded. And we regularly see there all kinds of interesting folks, like there was an exorcist not a long time ago. There are some paranormal experts. There was a medium, and the first thing that she said when she came on the radio is, "Oh, I'm not those medium, crackpots out there. I'm a real medium." That, to me, is where I would like to do very similar to what Monsieur Lapointe says, to call in and say to the ombudsman of facts and evidence, sorry, but that has to be tagged as being completely ludicrous. And then someone would say, well, what do you know? Open your mind. Maybe she is a real medium. There is something to be done somewhere in that sphere to allow us to start being able to bring in, and yes, we have to challenge Trevor, bad science all the time.
Talking about exorcism, the food babe. Why do you think that someone like that with no scientific background gets the following and the tremendous adherence to nonsense, when she knows nothing about science. She has built an empire on the notion that if you can't pronounce it, you shouldn't eat it. How is this happening, and why?
You don't trust me?
First of all, there has always been a sense of prescription around food and ritual and purity, notions of purity. People have been afraid of food as far back as we've recorded fear of food. The followers of Pythagoras were particularly scared about fava beans. And there's an anecdote of a group of Pythagoreans fleeing some pursuer, and they encounter a field of fava beans, and they decide to take the long way round. And had they taken the hypotenuse, they might have lived. And that's not mine. There's an Irish food scientist named Mike Gibney who relates that anecdote. He's a very, very interesting, actually. He's written several interesting books on food. Again, one of the tendencies is to think that we're constantly living in the age of the new. In the 70s and 80s, we had orthomolecular medicine. Came about by Linus Paulding. The idea that the food was controlling behavior. It infiltrated popular culture. You had people like Sheldon Adelson, who was the Dr. Oz of his day, promoting all sorts of cures for behavior. It led to frosting being banned in prisons in California because they were afraid just eating frosting would send the prisoners wild. So we are constantly being...
How much frosting is there in prison?
Apparently there was too much in California in the 70s. And it ultimately that reached a break with the Twinkie defense, which was the case of Harvey Milk. So we are constantly being ministered to throughout history on food. It was religious for most of the history. In the modern scientific age, you have prophets of purity. She's a prophet of purity, and she connects with people in a non-scientific way. I mean, we've had the organic and natural movement in the U.S. at least since the 1970s. You can trace it back to Germany in the 30s, the naturopathy. So these are deep roots, and she's the latest sort of prophet of pure living, and I honestly don't think science comes into it. She doesn't even know what she doesn't know.
And I think in a landscape where we're so confused, especially about food, people don't know what to believe. They have a sense that there's something wrong in the food environment and in the food system, and they don't know where to look. And you have someone who's offering these very clear, easy answers to things like, this chemical and that is actually what's making you tired and lethargic. If you just detoxify, you'll be fine. Whereas what many of us are writing about, it tends to be what I call it, Vox, the wet blanket. We call ourselves the wet blanket group because it's like, no, this diet that's kind of gone viral actually isn't going to help you lose weight. And this, amazing magnetic figure, whatever the health claim, whoever's promoting the health claim of the day, no, they're really actually not helping you. And that's a much, I think, less appealing and easy message than what the Food Babe has on offer.
I don't really know much about the Food Babe, but I'll venture the guess that the sort of the science people do themselves in everyday life, in a sense, involves what they eat and drink. And if you think about it, like if someone says, eat blueberries, you'll really feel great and notice the world around you, right? And I eat some blueberries, and suddenly I'm noticing I'm feeling really good. Why? Because the idea has been implanted into my head, and I think we experience the world anecdotally, and science tells us, no, your direct experiences are not as valid as these broad studies that took 5 years to do that involved 100,000 people, and that's where the real answer is. And that's counterintuitive for people. In a way, science asks people to discount their direct experiences a little bit. This sounds kind of like esoteric answer to the original question, but you know, it doesn't feel like the Earth is spinning. It looks like the sun's going around the Earth. You know, I mean, and science has been 500 years telling people that your direct experience of the world is not really true, and that problem is never going to go away.
Sure, I agree with everything I've heard. I think she's successful because she subscribes to what we call in TV the KISS principle. Keep it simple, stupid. You know, it's she's very direct, she's relatable, she's not standing there in a white lab coat, she's approachable, she's topical. We all want nuggets of him. Don't give me an entire paper, just give me your little 30 seconds standing in your beautiful kitchen. She lets us into her world. There's a cult of celebrity for some reason. If, you know, this person's famous and now we're getting little updates from her blog, well, then we're sort of like that, you know, the food babe in me. You know, so we want to feel that there's a relationship there. And blogs often have comments, so you can weigh in. And this is, you know, the most popular blog. She's doing it all. You can weigh in. There's a regular, you know, she doesn't post once every 6 months. She's regular. She's a part of your life. And I think she has just hit a niche in time for a lot of people. That makes her hugely appealing, and not all of her information is misinformation. There is stuff that she gets right, but that's the problem. What is the stuff that it's right, and what is the stuff that's not? There are no sources on the food babe.
Okay, we only have about 10 minutes left, so there's one question here that I think gets to really the heart of journalism that everyone here has had to deal with. And that is that virtually on every issue there's different opinions, but they don't have equal weight. And very often articles are written whereby a journalist will interview both sides of the issue and have the article come out as if both of them have equal weight, whereas that is almost never the case. So I'd like to solicit your opinions on that, on you know, how you handle that, how you write something properly weighted.
The principle of justice requires you to hear the other side. I think journalists need to hear the other side because you never know when you're being taken for a ride. And science is counterintuitive, so things that might instinctively appeal could turn out to be completely wrong. So it's very, very important to hear the other side. It is a mirror, as the philosopher Stuart Hampshire says, of the process of rationality itself, reasoning pro and contra over any decisions that you make. That doesn't mean that you simply you take the shortcut and report every side you interview, because the whole process of reporting should be figuring out what is the best truth that we can establish on this particular topic. Not just what necessarily everybody thinks, but you know, reporters are under pressure to write stories in ways that are frightening. The quick shortcut when I was a science writer at Newsweek was, you know, I had 500 words to write a story. I had to say what the study was. I had to get a comment from the authors. Then I had to get a comment from some other author, some other scientist, as what it all meant. And to do that very quickly. Then it got reduced to 400 words, then it got reduced to 350 words. And then I quit because it was pointless. The press releases were 3 times longer than the stories. It's a tricky thing because you have to be seen to be just. Otherwise, you don't have credibility with people. But it requires really in-depth reporting and knowledge of your topic to know when to say no to certain viewpoints.
And yeah, on like something like vaccine denialism or something, you want to know, why do people hold these views? I think it's very important to understand where people are coming from, and it's often a lot more nuanced than, and what their best arguments are. I always try to have that exercise, like, you know, here's the opposing point. What are their best arguments? What are the most reasonable people on that subject saying? But then when it comes to actually presenting it, you don't give it equal weight. You know, usually in science there's not two completely, usually the knowledge is accumulated and there's some truth that we're moving toward and trying to reflect that, I think, yeah, it represents the best of what we can do.
Well, that's because you have a background and you know how to filter stuff. But there are many, many articles written in newspapers by reporters who have no science background whatsoever. They've just been given a task to write about something.
I think it's gotten better though. Like I
It's
know,
better.
yeah,
It's better.
It's
But
gotten a little bit.
it still exists, and so they will go and interview the two sides and present it as if they're equal weight. I mean, the classic example there is climate change,
Right.
where you constantly see articles where the two sides are presented as if they were equally valid.
Yeah, there was a great piece in the BMJ. I can't remember who it was by, but I think the title was "Balance is Bias," and this idea that you really can't present things, the biased answer is really presenting things both ways, because that's not at all reflective of where the debate is. So yeah, definitely something to move away from, but actually Andre had a really, sorry to throw it over to you, but you had a great opinion before.
Yeah, I think I don't know any good science journalists who do 50-50. I think that's idea is long gone. And I think we're kind of ahead of the curve on that. I see this issue coming to the Trump campaign. Trump has sort of forced journalists to say, you have to challenge what people say. You don't just report. We used to do, I think, a lot too much stenography and not enough journalism. And I think we're seeing that in this election. And I think because of things like anti-vaccine, cell phones and cancer, et cetera, I think science journalists, we're forced to have that thought and that discussion and that different way of doing things a long time before the political journalists. And it's a good thing. And overall, I think what we have is that good science journalism is much better than it's ever been today, and the bad is much worse than it's ever been. And like society in general, there's not much middle anymore. It's just kind of disappeared. So I think we have to find a way to nurture that really good and marginalize the really bad. And I'm not sure how you do that.
I would agree with that. I agree that the problem of false balance is something that I think a lot of journalists have talked about in recent years, and I think we've gotten better at that issue. I will note that as in the same way that science does a lot of its work at the edge of what's knowable, in this really difficult terrain of uncertainty, a lot of journalism takes place in highly debatable topics. Now, not climate change. I agree with you. If we do a story on climate change, we shouldn't, just for the sake of false balance, put in a naysayer who's anti-scientific. But a lot of journalism takes place in contested terrain. There are going to be two sides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would agree. I think maybe just the nature of calling journalists reporters, suggests that we're just going to report everything, and there has to be a sieve, and with the experience and knowledge, you can filter down what you've collected and what your research is. I do think, though, there's a lot of, it's important to start out listening to both sides, and I think one place where we do a disservice is maybe by belittling. So I'm thinking of the anti-vaxxers, people who don't vaccinate their kids. It's not to make them look foolish or stupid. It's to try to figure out why they came to that conclusion and what we can do to try to to really just educate. Do a better job of education. I don't think people are ill-meaning or purposely acting with disregard to the health of their kids, but it's what they believe. Yeah, they're very passionate
about the child's health. So
that's right.
That needs to be recognized if you're going to have a conversation with them.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, and one of the biggest problems, whether you're writing, whether you're doing TV or radio, is the challenge of time or words. This is always the problem. So we're going to go directly to the last question here, and we will allot each of you 1 minute. Okay, what particular venture that you have undertaken do you think has had the greatest impact on your readers or your audiences?
So we created a statistical advisory board with the American Statistical Association. They are academics from around the US who volunteer their time to help journalists on deadline understand scientific data. We've had about 140 media queries since it launched about 15, 16 months ago. I think this is this and the work we're doing to promote clinical trial transparency whether more than half of clinical trials have never reported results. I think these are the two things that I think have a real opportunity to change culture.
Well done. Inside of a minute.
I can attest to that. Great work. At Vox, we created these articles that are called Show Me the Evidence, and they're trying to answer this problem of the flip-flopping daily headline, chocolate is good for you one day, bad the next, coffee is good for you one day, bad the next, and more systematically look at the body of research evidence that's accumulated on a topic. And they're pretty nerdy. They tend to be long. They're delving into meta-debates that are happening among researchers, but they've also been among the most popular articles I've written on this site, getting many, many impressions, and I think it shows that there is an appetite for this kind of work.
Joel wants to know if you have one on blueberries.
Yeah, exactly. Blueberries.
I love blueberries.
You've been funded by the blueberry industry.
Exactly, yeah, that's very suspicious. My best story is somewhere out there in the future, I hope. But the one thing I've been in the Washington Post 26 years, and I was the first person to write for this new thing called the internet, right out of our newsroom. So people would come in the morning at 10 o'clock, and sit around and talk, they'd go to lunch, and they'd file normally at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I was like, well, we could start in the morning and actually put the story up on the internet, in the middle of the day. And so I started a column in 1999 online. So that's my very small claim to fame in the Washington Post newsroom, that I was the first online writer.
So you're the reason we're now filing every hour?
Yeah, it's a bad, it was bad move.
Leave the room immediately. I guess I'd like to point to a most recent story that we did on Marketplace, where we applied for a license for a natural health product and actually got the license. And as a consequence of, because there are thousands and thousands of products that have been licensed by our federal health regulator with little or no science behind them. And not too long after that, Health Canada announced that it would no longer allow the makers of cold and flu remedies for kids 12 and under. You cannot make health claims on them anymore without science behind them. So there were natural health products, homeopathic products that were saying they could cure fevers and colds and relieve aches and pains, and they had no science, and they can't do that anymore. So that's a nice change that we like to take a little bit of credit for.
Well, thank you. And for those of you who might not know, in the audience, this continues tonight in a more formal way at the Centre Mont Royal, which is just across the street on Sherbrooke at 5:30. And tomorrow night at 5:30, Julia and Erica will be speaking tonight, and Trevor and Joel tomorrow night. And both nights, of course, promise to be interesting, informative, and entertaining. And of course, it's free, and everyone is invited. So thank everyone around here. And if anyone in the audience wants to ask any of our panelists a question after, I think they would be willing to chat. So thanks, everyone, and see you next year. Cheers.